Story time.
Hey there, ever heard those stories that make you truly believe in the mysterious ways of the divine? Well, let me tell you one that happened to a judge in Iraq back in '65. It's about his neighbor, a man who lived right next door. This neighbor wasn't wealthy by any means. He was a simple man struggling to support his family, which included his wife, 3 sons, 2 daughters, and his elderly mother. Sadly, his father had passed away, leaving him as the sole provider. He ran a small vegetable shop to make ends meet. Every evening, the judge would sit in his garden, listening to the sounds around him, including the footsteps of this hard-working neighbor. He found solace in hearing the familiar steps of this family's breadwinner. It was like he felt a part of their struggles. The judge recalled how the man would return home each night, sometimes with food, sometimes not, but always with love and dedication for his family. He'd bring home a crow, occasionally some meat or fruits from his shop, even if they were a bit overripe and unsellable. Instead of letting them go to waste, he'd share them with his family, who appreciated these small gestures immensely. The judge watched this family quietly, observing their hardships and their love for one another. Then tragedy struck. One day, the judge heard cries of anguish coming from the neighbor's house. He rushed over to find the family mourning the sudden loss of their father. The man's death left them devastated, as he was their only support. But from that moment on, everything changed. Neighbors came together to help bury the deceased, but the family was left in a dire situation. They had no choice but to adapt. The eldest son, just 15 at the time, had to leave school and take over his father's shop to support the family. And so, he did, working tirelessly like his father before him. For 3 years, he carried on the tradition of bringing home food every night, although it was never as abundant as before. Most of his earnings had to be reinvested in the shop to keep it running. Despite his efforts, the family's spirits were dampened after their father's death, and their situation only worsened over time. When the son turned 18, he was required to enlist in the Iraqi military as per their conscription laws. Faced with the prospect of losing their only source of income, the family deliberated. They had no other choice. It was either enlistment or starvation. Reluctantly, they decided to send him off to the military. However, they knew the consequences: imprisonment if he didn't show up. In some countries, there's no room for flexibility. So the family sat down with the boy, his siblings, his mother, and aunts, discussing their options. They finally reached a decision. They would sell their house. Time was running out, and after a month, they managed to sell the house for a meager sum. But just before the deadline, they received the cash from the buyer, a mere $4,000. And for 29 days, the mother had been tirelessly working to complete the paperwork for the transfer. Why the rush? Because the military had offered them an alternative. They could pay a fee to exempt the son from conscription. The fee was approximately $1,000 at the time, so they were given a month to come up with the money. If they didn't, the son would have to serve for 2 to 3 years. But as luck would have it, the month had almost passed when they finally received the money. But here's where the story takes a truly unexpected turn. On her way to deliver the payment, the mother encountered a taxi driver who, upon learning her urgency, agreed to take her despite not having enough passengers. She had to pay for the 5 passengers. Otherwise, the taxi wouldn't take her alone. He kept asking her why she had to pay for 5 people. She had to explain to him. She said, "No, my husband died in a car accident and he was on his way home. He was the only provider for the family. I had to let my son quit his studies, go to work, and thank God he worked for a year or two until he turned 18, and then the army took him. Now, I had no choice. We didn't have any other solution. I sold the house and took the money. This is the last day for me to pay the substitute for my son's military service." However, the taxi driver had nefarious intentions. Sensing her desperation and realizing she was carrying a significant amount of money, he saw an opportunity to enrich himself. During the journey, the mother's trust in the taxi driver quickly turned to fear and disbelief as he abruptly changed course, driving to a secluded area away from prying eyes. With no compassion, he dragged her immediately and threw her into the valley. In a shocking turn of events, the driver stopped the taxi and forcibly removed the mother from the vehicle and threw her down the valley. Then he went down to check if she had fallen, about 40 to 50 meters deep into the ground, into the valley. He went down to make sure she was dead. Indeed, he saw her, like a dead corpse. He took the money and got back in the taxi. Once arrived to destination, the taxi operators asked him to go back right away, as he was too late in their planning. As he drove along the road with passengers, he stopped at the same spot where he threw the woman in the darkness into a deep valley filled with wild animals. It was a risky move, as there was no chance she'd survive there with all those predators around. But as they say, God works in mysterious ways. The criminal always circles back to the scene of the crime. So, he said, "I just want to make sure." Suddenly he stopped in the middle of the road near the valley and said, "You guys stay here. I'm just going to take care of something." He walked about 30 or 40 meters until he reached the woman's body. But here's the shocker. The woman hadn't died yet. She was still clinging to life, bleeding, weak, and broken. What did he say to her? "You're still alive? You haven't died yet?" Then he bent down to touch her. But as God would have it, as soon as he lifted the rock, a snake came out and bit him. It was a highly poisonous snake, and as soon as it bit him, he let out a loud scream that echoed through the valley, startling those in the taxi. Of course, he collapsed when he got back to the taxi, and the passengers found the taxi driver lying on the ground beside the woman. They quickly drove them to the hospital. Unfortunately, the taxi driver didn't make it, but they managed to save the woman. She had fractures and was bleeding, but miraculously she survived. As for the snakebite, it was as if it gave her strength to endure. But what could she say to them? She had to tell them the whole story. When they rescued her, they took her to the nearby hospital where her son was training. When she regained consciousness, she told the investigators everything about her encounter with the taxi driver. The next day, they confirmed the snakebite. It was truly miraculous. So, the investigators reached into the taxi driver's pocket and found the woman's money. She told them, "Please, today is the deadline to deliver my son's payment." They assured her there was no problem since they knew the situation. They called her son from the training camp, and he came and received the money. With that money, he opened a large store, and he began to prosper, just as his father had done before him. This was the turning point in their lives. It's amazing how God works in mysterious ways. The judge later wrote about this story in his memoirs, amazed at the divine intervention. This is the end of our story. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. God bless you all, and goodbye.